Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Today, I've got a real treat for you. We're going to be taking a look at two really cool Finnish Mosins, and they're ones that look really similar, and they're often confused for each other, in fact, because there's a lot of weird variants and sub-variants and different makers and markings when we start talking about Finnish Mosins like these. And in particular today, what we're looking at is a Finnish M91 rifle, which is this guy, and a Finnish M24 rifle, which is this guy. Now, before we get into what these are, a caveat on this guy, the name of it, M24, some people call it different things. Now, I have looked at some of the sources that I trust the most in Finland, and both of them actually refer to this particular gun as the M/91-24. So the M91-24, whereas this one would be just the M91 essentially. So sometimes you'll hear this gun called the M24, pretty common, especially here in America. Sometimes you'll see it designated the M91-24, and sometimes you'll even see it the M1891 / or -24, just 24 being a designation of a revision that occurred in 1924 of that rifle. It's essentially what that means. Okay, with that out of the way, what exactly are these two rifles and why do they often get confused for each other? Well, when we start talking about Finnish Mosins, the M91 pattern of rifle is bound to come up because it comprised about half of the Finnish Army's rifles around the time of the Winter and Continuation Wars. And that's a lot of rifles. That's many tens of thousands of rifles. And what that boils down to is a rifle based off of the World War I Mosin-Nagant infantry rifle variant, the M91, also known as the M1891. And that variant essentially means that barrel is yay long, much longer than, say, even a 9130, very long barrel. And they'll have this really long handguard that's really unique to this model, and it'll have these barrel bands with these screws in them. Now, this one's interesting because this one has a Type 2 later rear barrel band and a Type 1 earlier style front barrel band. But that's how we know it's an M91 rifle. Essentially. There are some differences, though, and we're going to get into that, especially with this guy. But why are these rifles often confused with each other? Well, this was the big, like I said, this was the main variant of Finnish Mosins. They had a ton of different guns in Finland at the time, different Mosin variants, but generally speaking, or at least around half the rifles in their inventory would have looked in this pattern, in this length with a barrel band like this, and with a handguard like this, generally speaking. But just because we have this type of barrel length and stock and handguard and barrel band set up, there's still a lot of sub-variants within this overall pattern. And that is what we're talking about here today. So in order to get a little bit better of an understanding of why Finland had these particular guns, we need to go back to the time of the Finnish Civil War back in 1918. Now, this was a really tumultuous time in really all of Europe, with World War I raging on and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk signed, which basically got Russia out of World War I, and then started causing nations, like a domino effect, to then say, well, we're going to secede from Russia. So you would have some of the Baltic states, like Estonia. You would have the Ukraine declare its independence. You'd also have Finland declare its independence in 1918. A lot of people didn't really like that, especially the people that supported the Bolsheviks, because they obviously wanted to be a part of that new communist regime that had taken over the year prior in 1917 in November. So, of course, there was a civil war in Finland, and eventually the whites, the non-communist troops, came out on top. But you have to look in Finland. At that time, Finland was still part of Russia, so they had tons of Russia surpluses of Russian troops and Russian armories there full of these M91 rifles. Because remember, this is the main pattern of rifle that Russia had in that time. This was long before the 9130. This was the M1891 also known as the M91 rifle. It would have looked just like one of these rifles, essentially. Okay, so the dust settles, Finland's now an independent nation, and they start looking around at their inventory of rifles. This is mainly what they have, and then they decide to standardize upon this, and then that's where we start to see Finland do some horse trading in the 1920s and 1930s to get their hands on more Mosin rifles, and less of what some of the other things they had, like 8mm Mauser rifles, as well as ammunition in very large quantities. They would trade those across Europe for rifles like these. But within Finland, we have two separate branches of the military you could kind of think of. We would have the Finnish army, okay, but we'd also have the Finnish civil guard. And in this time, these two entities are very, very separate. They do their own thing. The civil guard, you could kind of think of it as like a national guard, like we would have here in America. A little bit different. We're not going to go down the interesting rabbit holes of what this Finnish civil guard was and wasn't, but they were essentially in charge of procuring their own rifles. They're a totally separate entity from the Finnish army at that time. Okay, so they look around, and in the early 1920s, late 19-teens, so around 1919, 1920, the civil guard starts looking around at the rifles in their inventory, and they have about 70,000, as far as I can tell, M91 rifles like these guys here in this overall pattern that would have looked just like these guys. 70,000. The problem was a lot of them had really rough barrel conditions, and a lot of them were so bad that they really needed to experiment with new ways of fixing that issue with really worn out barrels, right? So just be really worn, it's not going to shoot out, it's not going to have that great accuracy, your groupings aren't going to be that good. And in particular, the Finnish civil guard was even more picky about this than the Finnish army was, which should really tell you something. The Finnish civil guard really focused on accuracy as a top priority. Very, very different times back then. They were way ahead of their times. So accuracy being a huge priority, if you have bad barrels in your rifles, that's not gonna fly. So what did they do? Well, they looked around and they didn't really have any good barrel manufacturing capabilities yet. We do have the firm Tikkakoski, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, who actually produced the barrel on this rifle, but Tikkakoski didn't actually start producing Mosin Nagant barrels, or really any barrels, until around 1925. So at this time, the early 1920s, they're not actually producing anything yet. So if they need new barrels for Mosins, well, they're not going to get them from Tikkakoski. The SAT factory would have like a prototype production set up, but they weren't able to support large-scale manufacturing of barrels yet. And what would become Sacco, they weren't really there either. So really what we have here is a dilemma. We need barrels, but nobody within the country of Finland itself is going to be able to really provide them yet. So the civil guard looks around and says, okay, well, what do we do here? We need new barrels. We also need funds for new barrels. This was another problem. They needed money for new barrels, which they couldn't get in the country. So they need money, they need barrels. You could probably see where this is going. So they needed two things. They needed to find a source of barrels. They also needed a source of money for said source of barrels. So thankfully, though, we have a separate entity in Finland known as the Lottasvert. And that entity was essentially a group of volunteer women who set up essentially the 1920s version of the GoFundMe. And they ended up raising money for the Finnish Civil Guard, about 500,000 Finnish marks, if I'm not mistaken, in that time. Over that much. Which, let's be honest, that's kind of a lot of money back then. And it was enough to supply Finland with roughly over 20,000 Mosin Nagant barrels. That is a big deal. Okay, 70,000 guns. We don't know how many of them needed new barrels, but they were able to get over 20,000. So right off the bat, that kind of tells you, is an indicator of how badly off a lot of the barrels in their inventory were in the early 1920s. Okay, so they have the money, but where do they get barrels for these new or older M91 rifles left over from the Finnish Civil War? Well, they don't get them from Finland, right? They actually get them from two countries. One would be Germany, and two would be Switzerland. Now, in Germany, they would get it from a firm known as Böhler, and it seems like it was actually a conglomeration of several different firms supplying the barrels. That's going to be another topic for another day. We don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole there. Don't worry, we will have a very long, dry, long-winded video talking about that another time, so make sure to subscribe if you're interested in that. But I will spare you. Remember, the other one, though, is Switzerland, and in particular, it's probably a country you've heard of, or a company you've heard of, known as SIG. That's right, the SIG that's still around today and very famous. In fact, who is supplying the United States military with large swaths of arms. That SIG. Well, they also made Mosin barrels, of course, because they pretty much did everything at some point, it seems like. Okay, so the Finnish Civil Guard now has money that they can use to order barrels from Switzerland and Germany, okay? Now, these barrels would come in, and then they would take barrels, bad barrels, off of existing M91 rifles in their inventory. Again, this is the Civil Guard. And they would install these new barrels that they got from these two countries. And voila! Now we have the Finnish M91-24, also known as the M24 rifle. That is specifically what the M24 is. It's going to be an M91 pattern rifle with a barrel produced by either SIG or Böhler in Germany. All right, and the SIGs, we'll take a look at the markings here in a second. The SIGs, you'll be able to see, have the writing on the barrel. And Böhlers, actually, the markings are under the barrel, unfortunately. So you have to remove the stock to be able to see it. But that's how we know a rifle is an M24. An M24 Mosin, an M91-24 Mosin, is one that has a barrel ordered specifically by the Finnish Civil Guard, used by the Finnish Civil Guard in the 1920s. Now, some of y'all might be asking, well, Big Sam, what about the stepped barrels? That's a really good point. Now, I don't know how well you can see it on camera, but this guy actually has a stepped barrel. Now, where did this whole thing come from? Well, one of the things with a stepped barrel is that it's a heavier profile barrel than anything the Russians would have had previous in, like, say, World War I. Remember, you've got a heavier barrel. Theoretically, you could get better harmonics, better accuracy out of a thicker barrel. So that's a very Civil Guard thing to do. We want a heavier barrel because this rifle is not heavy enough. If you've ever handled a rifle with a stepped barrel like this one, this is a heavy rifle. I cannot stress that enough. Okay, so we have this wonderful stepped barrel here. But if you have a stepped barrel, it goes two ways here. If you have a stepped barrel, that doesn't mean it's a Finnish M24 rifle. And if you have a Finnish M24 rifle, it doesn't mean it's going to have a stepped barrel. So having a stepped barrel on its own doesn't really tell you the full story. And just seeing the markings of an M24 doesn't tell you that it has a stepped barrel. That's because some of the SIG M24s, I believe the first about 3,000, actually did not have stepped barrels. Those were the earliest ones they got. Those didn't have stepped barrels. Those are much less common, and we'll take a look at one of those in another video. For today, we just have the stepped barrel here. Now, this is commonly associated with M24s, which it really should be, because this is usually when you see it with M24s, because the vast majority of M24 rifles will have a stepped barrel. Again, some of them don't, though. But, remember, it goes both ways. Tikkakoski, remember in 1925, they were able to start getting barrel production going within Finland, which is pretty cool. And in 1927, they actually produced some M91 pattern rifles with a stepped barrel. Now, what would be the difference, the separation between that rifle with a stepped barrel and M91 rifle with a stepped barrel, made by Tikkakoski in 1927, with this, a Finnish M24 rifle produced by SIG with a stepped barrel? Well, the barrel length's the same, the stock is going to be the same, handguard will be the same, barrel bands will be the same. Really what it boils down to is going to be the barrel markings. It's going to be the big giveaway. Now, the M24 rifles get a little bit weirder because at least some of them, when they were made, had a sleeve, basically an aluminum tube going over the barrel. It would have been under the handguard about here. And the idea there was it could help to free float the barrel. I think that's about the first time we would see Finland use that. Now, we'll see that again when they start producing the M2830 rifle, which is probably much more well-known than this rifle. That's probably one of the most famous sniper rifles in history. No, technically it's not sniper rifles. Remember, the famous Finnish sniper in World War II, also known as White Death, used one of those with iron sights. And he's basically one of the most successful snipers in history. So very famous gun, but we're not talking about 2830s today. But I will mention it because M24s, one of the reasons they're a little bit less common is obviously production numbers. They didn't make many. They only made, they made less than 30,000 of these guns overall. But starting around 1935, it seems, these M24 pattern rifles in the Civil Guard. So remember that in 1935, these are still Civil Guard rifles. The Army doesn't have any of these yet. They would end up confiscating them sort of when the Winter War started, but again, that's another story. In 1935, though, we would start to see a program that would let men with these Finnish M24 rifles go ahead and pay with their own money to upgrade one of these to an M2830 rifle. That's pretty interesting. So we would see some M24s, and basically what would happen is the stock would get probably either get a new stock, or they would cut it and splice the new stock on here, and they would end up removing the barrel, and they would install a new M2830 barrel, which had the really fancy target sights, really nice guns. But some of these obviously were destroyed and lost in the war. Some of them were converted to other patterns, so these are kind of interesting guns. They have a very weird and interesting story. Okay, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole because we need to talk more about these guns. And now we can talk a little bit more about the M91, and then we'll go ahead and look at the markings in a second. But what's the difference between this one and this one? All right, well, the big difference we've identified is the M91 here does not have a stepped barrel. Remember, a few of these will that were produced by Tikkakoski in 1927, but vast majority, basically all Finnish M91s, will not have a stepped barrel. Now, when we talk about Finnish M91s, we have to be a little bit careful about understanding what it is we're talking about, because it could be an original World War I gun that maybe Finland has either in the original stock or a two-piece splice stock like we see on this guy, or it could be one that they rebarreled. The Army had rebarreled, like this one, which has been rebarreled. And again, we'll see that in a second. But this is a Finnish M91, and this barrel was rebarreled by Tikkakoski. There's that name again. But this one was much later. This was in 1942, this guy was produced. So we would see Tikkakoski rebarrel some M91s for the Army in the 1920s, but the vast majority of the ones we see are actually during the Continuation War in the 1940s, and even at the end of the Winter War, even starting around 1940, then going up through, this one is 1942. So, a lot of different variants, but Tikkakoski made some as well, and then also we would see some made by VKT, also known as Valmet, another very famous company. Again, those you're going to see from the 1940s, although VKT did produce some other barrels And I think we've looked at one of those before on a M27. Now again, another rabbit hole I'm going to try to dodge because I could talk about Mosins all day long, folks. Okay, so VKT made some for the Army. And these are M91 rifles. We're not talking about the M24 rifles. And also we would see an interesting thing that we would have some barrels contracted from Belgium. And they typically marked with a big B as in Bravo on the barrel. So Tikakoski, Belgium, VKT, and a lot of times they would take a barrel off of a gun and of an old gun, could be even an antique barrel from the 1890s, and they would take that and then put it on just a different receiver. So like maybe sometimes you had a barrel that was good, but the receiver got damaged somehow. And then you have another gun over here where the receiver's good, but the barrel's damaged, so you would end up swapping the receivers. So you'd have a good receiver and made it with a good barrel, and then throw the other bad barrel and the bad receiver away. So these all sorts of, we could talk about this all day long, all sorts of weird variants when we're talking about Finnish Mosins, especially these M91 patterns of rifles. Okay, so now I think you have a better idea of the difference between an M24 and M91. We're going to look at the markings here, but let's just do a quick recap. The M24, also known as the M91-24, which is this guy, is specifically a rifle produced by the Civil Guard that has a barrel contracted by SIG or Böhler in Germany. Most of them have a stepped barrel, but some of them do not. That's what an M24 is. An M91 is basically any Finnish Mosin like this one, a Finnish M91 specifically, that could be an original Mosin from World War I or before, or it could be one a little bit later from the 20s, or it could be one that Finland had the barrel replaced on, specifically the Army. Because remember, if they replaced it with one of these barrels, it's going to be designated an M24. If it was replaced with a barrel other than an M24 barrel, it'll just still be an M91, just like a Finnish M91. Okay, that was a lot of ranting. So now let's get past the boring part and cut to some of the cool stuff, and we'll look at some of the markings to help you distinguish some of the differences. All right, so first things first, we're going to take a look at our M24 rifle. Now first, let's check out the barrel markings. We're going to see our classic Civil Guard S within a shield with the three little trees coming out off of the top of the S. That is a Finnish Civil Guard marking. And you'll typically see that on M24 rifles. Now on this one, if we look here on the side of the barrel markings, we can see this guy says Schweiz Industrie Gesellschaft Neuhausen, which of course is SIG. This one's also unique because it has these pretty uncommon Finnish Civil Guard cloverleaf markings. Those are really cool to see. You don't see those too often. Now on a lot of these rifles, because these are Civil Guard rifles, some of them tend to have Civil Guard district numbers on them, like that guy. See that? And that one was crossed out, and then on the barrel was replaced with a new Civil Guard district. So you can actually track where this rifle was used. Again, that's pretty cool. So again, this shield right here, you won't see that on an M91 pattern of rifle, because that automatically designates that this is in fact a Civil Guard rifle. And that basically tells you right away that this is going to be an M24 rifle, basically. And now if we move up here, we can see our stepped barrel. So which means the whole barrel is thicker, but they stepped it here, so a standard sized bayonet would still fit on here. And that's why it's not thicker all the way down here. Bayonet still has to fit, so that thickness stopped, and there's a step here where it gets smaller in diameter. This, folks, is a Finnish M24. It may have a one-piece stock like this guy. It may have a two-piece stock like the other guy we're about to look at, but whatever the case, because of that barrel, this is a Finnish M24, also known as a Finnish M91-24. Now, the M91 here is going to be a lot more common, generally speaking. There are some weird things that can make one of these more less common, such as if it had a stepped barrel, then a stepped barreled M91 would be less common than a stepped barreled M24, but again, that's another topic for another day. Well, let's look at the barrel markings on this guy. Now, some of y'all have seen this rifle before because we took a look at this one in a video talking about how this one's actually an antique because this receiver was actually produced in 1898. Pretty cool. Antique status in America, at least. So here we see this barrel was produced by Tikkakoski. That is that T within a triangle within a circle. There's a lot going on there. That is Tikkakoski. And then there's our serial number. And then we were produced here in 1942. So we know this is a Finnish M91 because of the barrel length. And it has this classic M91 handguard with these rivets. And these big barrel bands with these screws in them, which is kind of hard to see on the camera angle. But they have these screws here. Maybe if I flip this guy over. There we go. We can see. Right there. Okay. So because we have those barrel bands and this barrel length, it's an M91 pattern. And then if it has that particular barrel, bearing a Finnish Civil Guard marking, then we would say it's an M91 / variant 24, like this guy. But other than that, I mean, these rifles are very similar, and you can probably see why these rifles often get very confused with each other. Especially if this one had a straight barrel, which some of the M24s do, or this guy had a stepped barrel, which a few of the M91s did. Again, Finnish Mosins can be very confusing, and the terminologies can just be really, really confusing. Because it also doesn't help that different people have different things they like to call these guns by. But hopefully this long-winded video helps give a better explanation of the similarities and differences of what these rifles are. Because I remembered when I was getting into Mosins, I was looking at a rifle like this, a Finnish M91, that was rebarreled by Tikkakoski in the 1940s, and I actually originally thought it was an M24 rifle. Because, well, it was rebarreled by Finland, and it's an M91 length pattern, that must make it an M24, right? And I actually had a hard time finding good documentation on this, but no, it's still an M91, even if it was rebarreled, unless that new barrel is a Finnish Civil Guard barrel produced by SIG or Böhler. Then it's an M24. But if that's not the case, then it's an M91. Okay. So hopefully this helps reiterate exactly what these rifles are and what they aren't. And hopefully we've cleared up some ambiguity for y'all today. So I appreciate y'all watching. If you like more Mosin content like this, please consider subscribing. Let me know if y'all got any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.